Welcome to Boring History, where we dive into the quiet, overlooked details of the past. Tonight, we travel back to the rugged frontier nights, exploring how early settlers defended their cabins, faced the wilderness, and created a fragile sense of safety in a world full of unknown dangers. The frontier cabin stood as more than just a shelter. It was a fragile outpost of civilization carved into the edge of wilderness. A simple construction of rough, hewn logs, not always perfectly cut or fitted, but strong enough to withstand the pressing winds, the long nights, and the possibility of intrusion, yet always vulnerable in the minds of those who lived inside it. Defense, for the early settlers, was not a luxury or a specialized plan reserved for emergencies. It was a way of life, woven into every nail driven, every log stacked, and every stone placed. The cabin was not only a place to eat, sleep, and gather with family, but also a fortification, an anchor against the unknown, and settlers devoted thought, time, and labor to how it could withstand the dangers they felt pressing. From beyond the clearing, each cabin was constructed with defense in mind. Even if the builders were ordinary farmers and not soldiers, even if their tools were crude and their supplies meager, the very choice of location carried defensive considerations. For a cabin too close to dense woods gave potential intruders cover, while one too far into open ground left its occupants exposed to the elements. Settlers often cleared trees in a wide circle, creating a buffer zone, a bare patch of land that denied concealment and gave early warning of approach, whether it was a prowling animal, a traveler, or a hostile figure in the night. The clearing itself became the first line of defense, not by force, but by the simple openness it created, turning the wilderness into a watchful stage around the homestead. The logs themselves, thick and overlapping, formed walls that could stop arrows, blunt blows, and resist flames for a time, especially when chinked with clay or mud. Some settlers, drawing on traditions from Europe or from local practices they observed, stacked their cabins low and squat, minimizing openings and keeping them close to the ground, the smaller structure harder to breach, the thicker roof harder to set alight. Windows were rare, small, and shuttered, less for comfort and more for safety, and when they existed, they often doubled as firing slits, narrow enough to shield the inside while giving a line of sight outward. Doors were not flimsy panels but solid slabs of wood, sometimes reinforced with crossbars, hung on hand-forged iron hinges if luck permitted, or on simple wooden pivots if resources were scarce. At night these doors were barred from within, a thick beam set in brackets holding it fast, giving the family inside at least the reassurance of a locked threshold. Even if they knew determined force could test it around some cabins, families built stockades, upright timbers driven into the ground side by side, rising above a man's head, enclosing not just the dwelling, but also a small yard, a space for animals and stores. These palisades gave additional security, forcing any intruder to scale or break through before reaching the home itself. Even without full stockades, settlers often set up obstacles, brush piles, thorn hedges, or makeshift barriers of stones and stumps, crude but effective deterrents. In some cases, trenches were dug, shallow but wide, making a direct rush difficult, slowing down movement just enough to give warning. Each layer of construction reflected the constant thought that safety could never be taken for granted. That defense had to be built into daily existence inside the cabin. Defense extended to the placement of tools and weapons. Muskets and rifles, though scarce and precious, were kept within reach, leaned near the door, hung above the hearth, or rested in corners where hands could find them quickly. Powder horns and shot bags were stored close by, ready for sudden need. Axes, though meant for chopping wood, doubled as weapons, their weight and sharpness effective in desperate hands. Even cooking implements, iron skillets, or long-handled forks, could serve as last measures if an intruder breached the walls. Families often rehearsed, silently or in whispered discussions, what each member would do if danger came, who would guard the door, who would tend to the children, who would douse sparks if fire arrows struck the roof. These routines, though rarely written down, became ingrained, as much a part of daily life as fetching water or tending animals. The roof itself, often thatched with straw or bark, covered, was a point of concern, for it was vulnerable to fire. Settlers learned to keep buckets of water nearby, to drape damp hides or cloths over the most exposed areas, to watch for embers that might fall during attacks. Chimneys, rough and wide, were sometimes reinforced with stone when available, as stone resisted flame better than timber. In the absence of stone, settlers would clay the chimneys heavily, thickening them as much as possible. These measures may have seemed small, yet in the tense nights, when every sound in the woods could be an enemy, the knowledge that precautions were in place gave a measure of calm to those who lay on straw beds. Listening dogs, though companions and helpers, were also early warning systems. Their sharp ears and restless barking gave precious minutes of preparation, and many cabins relied on their presence more than walls or weapons. Bells tied to gates or doors offered another layer of alarm, a simple sound carrying far in the quiet of night. Settlers understood that defense began not with combat, but with awareness, and so they used every means to extend their senses outward, creating barriers of sound and signal long before a stranger reached the threshold. Children grew up learning to notice patterns, to distinguish between the natural rustle of a deer in brush and the irregular crackle of a human footstep, to know when the silence of the woods was too complete, too deliberate, a silence that often meant unseen eyes were watching. Many cabins, particularly in more exposed regions, were clustered with others, for proximity itself was a form of defense. Neighbors, though separated by fields and forest, kept lines of sight when possible, cleared paths between their clearings, and created signals to alert one another. A horn blown in the night, a shot fired twice in quick succession, or even a lantern set high in a window could serve as a call for aid. While each cabin was its own bastion, the settlers knew that defense worked best when joined, that the strength of one family multiplied when others could be summoned, and so their construction and routines extended beyond the log walls into the larger network of shared survival. The very design of sleeping arrangements carried defensive logic. Families often slept in the central room, close together, rather than spread across multiple chambers. Lofts were used for children, partly to keep them warm, partly because the height gave some shelter from arrows or sudden breaches at the door. The hearth, central to warmth and cooking, was also central to defense, for it provided light, smoke, and a steady place around which family members gathered, weapons within reach, doors and shutters within sight. The rhythm of life inside the cabin, from dawn chores to evening prayers, always kept one eye on the possibility of intrusion, a constant readiness born not of paranoia, but of experience handed down from one family to the next. The psychological element of defense was as important as the physical. Knowing the door was barred, the shutters closed, the dog tied near, the rifle loaded, gave settlers the courage to rest, to face the next day's labors. These measures did not guarantee safety, but they gave structure to fear. They transformed the vast unknown into a set of precautions and practices. The cabin thus became both home and fortress, its very construction telling a story of vigilance. Every notch in the log, every stone in the hearth, every peg in the door frame carried the weight of survival, of choices made not just for comfort, but for endurance. Settlers might have dreamed of gentler homes, of wide windows and open porches, but in the wilderness the narrow slit and the barred door became the architecture of necessity. Even as cabins varied in size and style, from the simplest one-room hut to larger multi-room dwellings, the logic of defense remained constant. Strength in the walls, barriers outside, readiness within, and awareness stretching into the night. These homes were not castles in grandeur, but they were castles in intent, miniature fortresses designed by ordinary hands against extraordinary uncertainty. Defense was not a separate chapter of their existence, it was written into the grain of the wood and the routines of daily life, a continuous preparation that never truly ended. For the frontier itself was a place where no one ever declared safety complete. When the sun sank beyond the tree line and shadows stretched across the clearing, the work of the frontier day did not end. It merely shifted into a quieter, more cautious rhythm that revolved around survival. Night on the frontier was unlike night in a town or village where neighbors, lamps, and patrols offered a sense of nearness. For in the wilderness night was vast, dark, and alive with sounds that could not always be identified. Settlers prepared for it with a steady ritual, a sequence of tasks and habits that blended necessity with defense, chores with vigilance, each gesture part of a larger pattern designed to keep life going until dawn returned. Nightly survival routines were not just about going to bed. They were about holding ground against cold, hunger, predators, and threats both seen and unseen. The first part of this nightly rhythm began before true darkness fell, in the twilight hours when there was still enough light to see clearly. Families gathered firewood, not in small piles but in armfuls and stacks, for a fire that faltered during the night could mean not just cold but danger, as light and smoke discouraged prowling animals and signaled life within. Wood was carried inside or kept near the hearth, arranged so that even the smallest child could add a stick if needed. Kindling was gathered carefully, dry chips, bark or moss, stored in baskets or tucked near the chimney to ensure the flame could be coaxed back if it waned. Alongside the wood, coals from the day's fire were banked under ash, kept smouldering to save effort, and spark for the morning animals were brought in close, sometimes into pens within the stockade, sometimes tied near the cabin itself, for their safety was linked to the family's survival. Chickens were closed in crude coops, cows and horses secured in stalls or tethered where they could not wander into the woods. This was not merely to keep them from straying, but to shield them from wolves, bears, and thieves who prowled the edges of settlement. Livestock noises in the night also served as signals, for sudden panic among them often meant something had approached. Buckets of water were filled and set inside, drawn before darkness made the trip to the creek or well too dangerous. Tools were put away, doors fastened, and the outer yard cleared of anything that could trip or slow movement in the dark. These small acts, repeated each evening, formed the groundwork of the frontier's nightly defense. As true night descended, shutters were drawn tight, doors barred, and every crevice checked. Some settlers stuffed rags or moss into cracks, not only to block drafts but to stifle points of light that might leak out and reveal the cabin's position to watchful eyes. Silence became part of the routine. Voices lowered, movements softened, for sound carried far in the night air. Children were hushed and often rocked into sleep early, not only to rest but to still them so that adults could listen with unbroken attention. The hearth became the heart of the cabin, its glow the single trusted light, and around it the family settled into positions where they could reach each other quickly and hear every creak of the logs or scrape outside the door. Meals at night were simple, often stews or porridge that could simmer quietly on the fire without much tending. Heavy meals were rare, for supplies were rationed carefully, and no one wanted to dull their senses with overindulgence when alertness was precious. Food was eaten slowly, sometimes in near silence, as ears strained for movement in the woods. The act of eating was less about enjoyment and more about maintaining strength for the labors of the next day, each bite a measured part of endurance. Dishes were washed quickly, scraps fed to animals or buried to keep them from attracting predators. Then, as bellies settled and the outside world grew darker, came the slow procession of nightly watchfulness that defined frontier life. Watches were often kept informally, with one or two members of the household staying awake longer, eyes fixed on the fire or ears tuned to the night. Fathers or elder sons often took this role, sometimes dozing in chairs, muskets across their knees, roused by the smallest sound. In smaller cabins, families rotated who would rise in the middle of the night to check the yard or stoke the fire, a rhythm that fractured sleep but offered reassurance. The silence of night was not empty, for it was filled with noises. The cry of an owl, the rustle of branches, the snapping of twigs under the weight of deer, the distant howls of wolves, the unsettling quiet that often came before something drew close. Each sound was weighed in the mind, judged, and filed away, part of an endless mental catalogue of what was ordinary and what was not. Children's sleep routines reflected survival as well. Beds were not scattered luxuriously but clustered close, straw ticks laid near the hearth or up in lofts, blankets shared to preserve warmth. In many cabins, children slept in their clothes, ready to run or hide if sudden alarm came. Parents whispered prayers or told quiet stories, not simply to comfort, but to steady young minds against the fear that could rise with the darkness. These stories often mixed scripture, folklore, and practical advice, teaching through narrative what to do if woken suddenly, where to hide, when to stay silent. In this way, the nightly routine was also an education, the shaping of habits that would one day keep a grown child alive, when it was their turn to guard the hearth and door. The fire was never left untended. Flames were fed slowly, kept low enough to avoid drawing attention, yet alive enough to prevent the cabin from sinking into cold. Too much light could silhouette the cabin against the dark woods, but too little meant vulnerability to chill and the loss of a protective glow. Some settlers learned to shield their hearths, arranging stones or boards to keep light from spilling too brightly outside. The balance between warmth, light, and concealment was delicate, adjusted differently each night depending on weather, mood, and unease. When winds howled or snow fell, the fire burned brighter, and its crackle offered comfort. When nights were still and moonlit, flames were banked low, the family huddling closer in the dim glow, trusting more to silence than to light weapons, always close at hand, were checked again before sleep. Powder was kept dry, flints tested, blades sharpened, bows strung and unstrung with care. Some families hung a musket above each sleeping area, others leaned them against doors or window sills, ready for immediate use. Ammunition was rationed so carefully that waste was unthinkable. But readiness was essential, for an unarmed cabin was scarcely more than a wooden box vulnerable to whatever pressed against it. In this way, the very act of preparing for rest became an act of war readiness. The transition from waking labor to nightly endurance communication with neighbors also formed part of nightly routines. Signals were arranged, sometimes as simple as a lantern hung in a particular way, a horn blast, or even a dog's chain rattled in a certain rhythm. Families knew what to listen for in the distance, the sound of a single shot echoing too sharply, the unnatural silence of dogs that usually barked. These unspoken agreements gave shape to the night, forming invisible threads between scattered cabins, each one alone but tied together through watchfulness. In the absence of walls or guards, these networks were what gave settlers the sense that they were not wholly abandoned to the dark woods around them. Weather also dictated much of nightly survival. In summer, windows and shutters had to be balanced between ventilation and security, air let in sparingly, never enough to make the cabin vulnerable. Mosquitoes and insects thrived in the heat, and settlers burned herbs or smouldering coals to keep them at bay, their acrid smoke a nightly companion. In winter, every crack was stuffed, every hide or blanket used, bodies pressed close under layers. The fire fed constantly with logs so precious that each one was chosen carefully. Nights of snow meant silence outside, so deep that any movement stood out like a drumbeat, while nights of rain carried steady pattering that masked other sounds, making vigilance harder but no less necessary. The seasons shaped how people survived the night, forcing them to adapt not only their chores but their senses inside the cabin. Nightly tasks also included the care of tools and supplies. A rifle might be cleaned in the dim firelight, an axe sharpened on a stone, shoes mended with thread, or harness checked for wear. These chores, quiet and deliberate, filled the hours before sleep, making use of every moment when daylight no longer allowed field work or travel. The repetition of these acts, night after night, gave rhythm to frontier existence, anchoring people against the vast uncertainty outside. It was in these small, steady labors that survival was quietly built, not through grand battles or sudden triumphs, but through the endless maintenance of what little they had. Sleep itself was cautious, rarely deep, always light enough to wake at the sound of a creak or the bark of a dog. Dreams were short and often troubled, but the body accepted what rest it could, for the dawn would demand work regardless of the night's unease. Some settlers spoke of waking multiple times each night, tending the fire, listening, staring through the shutters at the tree line, then lying back down with one hand still on a weapon. Others trusted in the strength of their routines, in the knowledge that they had barred the door, checked the animals, listened long enough, and so they allowed themselves moments of surrender to the darkness. Thus the frontier night unfolded in long hours of quiet labor, watchfulness, and rest that was never fully restful. Every act, from drawing water to banking the fire, from latching the shutters to soothing a child's fear, carried with it a weight of survival. The cabin became a world in miniature, its walls the edge of safety, its routines the thin line between order and chaos. These routines, unremarkable in detail yet monumental in necessity, formed the unbroken chain that linked one day to the next, one generation of settlers to the next. all of them learning the same lessons under the same stars. Each night survived another step in the long endurance of life on the frontier. The wilderness at night was not silent, and for settlers it was never empty. It pressed against the walls of the cabin with every rustle of leaves, every howl carried on the wind, every flicker of shadow that shifted beyond the clearing, and within that darkness lay threats both natural and human that made every evening a test of endurance. The wilderness itself was a force, unpredictable and often merciless. Its animals, its storms, its hunger for firewood and food supplies, all adding to the weight of survival. And alongside these challenges were the dangers posed by raiders, men who appeared suddenly from tree lines or riverbanks, striking fast and leaving little behind but fear and ruin. And it was against both these enemies, the untamed land and those who sought to exploit it, that nightly routines of vigilance took their shape. Predators were an ever-present concern, for the forests of the frontier teemed with wolves that roamed in packs, their howls rising in the distance before closing in near the livestock pens. A cow or sheep left untended could vanish by morning, its bones scattered, its absence a wound to the fragile supply of food and milk that meant survival. Wolves were not merely nuisances, they were direct competitors for the settlers' sustenance, clever in their approach, testing fences and circling fields under cover of darkness. Bears too presented danger, their strength capable of tearing through flimsy coops or smashing apart storage barrels in search of salt pork, honey, or grain. Their raids on cabins were rare but deeply feared, for no barred door felt secure against claws that could split logs. Even smaller predators, foxes, bobcats, raccoons, gnawed at the edges of survival, stealing eggs, scattering corn, carrying disease, each one a reminder that the wilderness was not a neutral backdrop, but a living force pushing back against the fragile hold of human habitation. Venomous snakes slithered near cabins, drawn by warmth or by the mice that shared grain stores, and their bite could cripple or kill without warning, leaving families helpless in the long night when no doctor was within reach. Insects carried threats too, mosquitoes swarming in clouds that left fever behind, flies contaminating food, swarms of locusts capable of stripping gardens bare. The settlers' defenses were not only against human attack, but against this constant pressure of the natural world, where every movement in the grass could be dangerous, every hole in the wall an invitation to pests, every shift in the wind a sign of approaching storms that could turn safety into ruin. Weather itself was one of the greatest threats, for storms on the frontier could arrive with little warning, winds tearing roofs, rains flooding clearings, lightning igniting dry fields and turning cabins into tinderboxes. Snowstorms buried paths and sealed doors, cold driving deep into the bones of the house, every log straining against the weight of frost. Survival against nature's wrath required preparation, but no amount of preparation guaranteed protection, and settlers often lay awake listening to the howl of wind through trees, hoping the roof would hold, hoping the river nearby would not flood, hoping the chimney would not collapse under ice. The wilderness punished lapses of attention swiftly, and the nightly fear of what the land might unleash was as real as fear of wolves or strangers. Yet alongside the threats of animals and weather, there was the looming presence of raiders, human figures who moved as shadows between the trees, their motives shifting with circumstance but their effect always the same: fear, destruction, loss. Some raiders were desperate outlaws, men pushed from towns and settlements, surviving by theft and violence, their eyes set on the food and tools that cabins sheltered. Others were rival settlers, hard men hardened further by disputes over land, water, and hunting rights, their grudges spilling into acts of arson, assault, or abduction under cover of night. Still others were organized groups, bands that learned to strike when vigilance slipped, when exhaustion dulled the senses of families inside, when dogs slept and fires smoldered low. For settlers, the thought of a raid was more than fear of property lost. It was fear of invasion into the one fragile space they called safe, the violation of hearth and bed that left no place untouched. The methods of raiders varied, sometimes silent approach and sudden breach, sometimes the terror of fire arrows lofted onto thatched roofs, flames kindling before sleepy eyes could adjust to the danger. They might drive off livestock, leaving families weakened and unable to endure the coming season, or seize tools and weapons, stripping away defenses in a single night. In harsher cases they might take captives, their absence more haunting than any burned wall, for those left behind did not know if they lived or perished. The fear of raiders was not only in the act itself, but in the anticipation, in the knowledge that the wilderness provided endless cover for those who chose violence, that the trees, rivers, and hills offered paths of approach invisible to those huddled by their hearths. Every creak in the brush, every unusual silence in the dog's bark, every shadow that lingered too long could be read as a warning, and so nights were filled with listening, waiting. Measuring settlers adapted with strategies born of necessity, clearing wide perimeters so that raiders had less cover, planting thorn hedges to slow a charge, setting tripwires that rattled pans or rang bells to give warning. Fires were kept low to avoid giving away exact positions. Shutters closed tightly to prevent light from spilling outward, making cabins appear deserted from afar. Some families practiced silence as defense, speaking in whispers at night, stepping softly on wooden floors, avoiding signs of life that might draw unwanted eyes. In settlements where multiple cabins stood near, watches were coordinated with signals, gunshots, horns, lanterns, used to rouse neighbors at the first sign of threat. Even so, the possibility of surprise never vanished, and the weight of this possibility pressed heavily on every nightly ritual, shaping lives into constant readiness. The psychological toll of such threats was immense, for fear did not end with dawn, it lingered in memory, each attack or close encounter reinforcing the sense that safety was never absolute. Children grew up in this atmosphere, learning from their earliest years to stay silent at sudden noises, to hide quickly when told, to trust in routines that might save them. Women and men both carried weapons as they moved about their chores, always mindful that danger could strike even in the simplest act of fetching water or cutting wood. The frontier thus bred not only hardship but vigilance, a ceaseless awareness of vulnerability that infused daily life with caution, making even the act of sleep an uneasy truce with the unknown. Natural threats and human threats often intertwined, one amplifying the other. A storm might drive raiders to strike when families were distracted, or wolves might scatter livestock just as settlers prepared for defense. A fire lit by lightning could be mistaken for arson, or an arson fire for lightning, confusion itself becoming another layer of danger. The wilderness provided cover not only for animals, but for those who knew how to move like them, blending into shadows, using the cries of owls or the snapping of branches to mask their approach. To live on the frontier was to face enemies that were sometimes obvious and sometimes invisible, threats that could be fought with muskets or axes, but also threats that slipped into the mind, making fear itself a nightly adversary, even in relative peace. Settlers carried stories of past attacks, of families lost, of cabins burned, of raids remembered in whispered detail. These stories were told as warnings, lessons wrapped in fear, reinforcing the need for vigilance, shaping behavior long after the immediate threat had passed. Each family's nightly survival routines bore the imprint of such tales, the memory of others' losses folded into their own defenses. In this way, threats extended beyond the physical moment of encounter. They lived on as part of the cultural fabric of the frontier, reminders that no clearing, no stockade, no barred door was ever beyond danger's reach for settlers. The wilderness and the raiders within it were inseparable from the experience of survival. The sounds of night, the silhouettes of trees, the glow of embers, all were haunted by possibility. The knowledge that predators and men alike might be watching from the dark. To endure required not just strong walls or ready weapons, but the constant discipline of preparation, the acceptance that life itself was fragile and that each night was a battle of patience as much as strength. The frontier was not merely a place of building and growing, but a place of enduring, where threats from the wild and from those who moved through it shaped every breath, every glance, every decision, and every slow hour passed waiting for the first light of morning. Life on the frontier was never lived in isolation. Even when cabins stood far apart and families seemed alone in their clearings, for survival in such conditions depended on bonds woven between neighbors, ties of trust, shared labor, and mutual vigilance that stretched across the distances of fields and forests. The wilderness was too vast, the threats too many, and the resources too scarce for any one family to endure without others. and so community became both shield and anchor, binding settlers into networks of watchfulness that made the difference between endurance and collapse. The bonds that grew were not always easy or peaceful, for personalities clashed and disputes arose, but the knowledge that safety itself was collective tempered differences and taught people to set aside quarrels when danger pressed against their lives. From the earliest stages of settlement, the need for cooperation shaped where cabins were built and how people lived. Families chose sites not only for soil or water, but for proximity to others, knowing that within shouting distance or a short ride lay the difference between standing alone and being able to summon help in an instant. Clearings were cut in patterns that kept lines of sight open, trails were marked between homesteads, and signals were agreed upon long before the first true danger arrived. A horn blast, a single shot fired in the night, a lantern hung high in a loft window. Each carried meaning, each told a neighbor that watchfulness was needed, and this network of signs stitched separate cabins into one organism of alertness. Fragile but vital, the work of daily life often reinforced these bonds. Men gathered for barn raisings, log rollings, and harvests, lending muscle to each other's labor in tasks too large for one family alone. Women shared spinning, weaving, and the tending of children, exchanging not only goods but advice, comfort, and vigilance over little ones. Children themselves grew up crossing from one cabin to another, running errands, carrying news, learning which paths were safe, which fields were watched, which households would always open their door. Each of these small connections created layers of interdependence, so that when night came and fear pressed close, families could draw strength from knowing others were also awake, listening, keeping their own fires low and their weapons near. The thought that one was not entirely alone steadied hearts in the long dark hours. Nightly vigilance often extended outward through community watch. Families would rotate who walked the perimeter of the clustered cabins, who sat awake with musket in hand, while others rested, who kept the dogs close to the livestock pens, and who circled the tree line with lanterns shaded to avoid drawing attention. In settlements large enough, formal watches were arranged, men meeting at dusk to divide hours, women sometimes taking their turns when the burden of work left no alternative. Even in smaller outposts, informal pacts ensured that someone was always listening, someone was always alert, and the signal of alarm would not fall on deaf ears. This rotation of wakefulness created a rhythm that outlasted exhaustion, for tired eyes trusted that others were watching when they could no longer bear to trust was the foundation of such arrangements. Yet it was also fragile, for betrayal or negligence could mean disaster. Communities therefore bound themselves tightly through rituals of cooperation, shared meals, collective prayers, and the constant exchange of small favors. Borrowed tools, traded seed, exchanged news. All were threads in the fabric of vigilance, each gift a reminder that one's own safety depended on another's alertness. Gossip too became a form of survival, for knowing who was reliable, who kept watch faithfully, who drank too deeply, or who neglected their fences, could mean the difference between choosing a trustworthy partner in an emergency or finding oneself abandoned when alarm sounded. Thus the social life of the frontier, however small, was shaped by necessity, each relationship measured not only in kindness, but in reliability. When danger arrived, religion often deepened these bonds, for shared faith offered language and ritual that united settlers in the face of uncertainty. Prayer meetings and Sabbath gatherings were more than spiritual acts. They were chances to reaffirm solidarity, to share information about threats, to coordinate defenses, to remind each other that vigilance was a sacred duty as well as a practical one. Hymns sung in rough, hewn chapels or in open clearings carried not only words of hope, but also the sound of voices joined, reinforcing the idea that no one faced the wilderness alone. The moral codes shaped by such gatherings reinforced watchfulness, teaching that to fail in one's duty to neighbors was to fail before God, and that vigilance was a form of love as well as defense. Trade also bound communities. As surplus corn, milk, hides, or tools flowed between households, each exchange strengthening ties of obligation. When one family provided seed to another, when one lent a plow or repaired a musket, it created an unspoken contract that assistance would be returned. And in times of alarm, these debts were repaid not with goods but with presence. A neighbor who had helped in the field might be the first to arrive at a cabin under threat, musket in hand, not only because it was right, but because bonds of reciprocity demanded it. In this way, even the smallest transactions of daily life became part of the larger web of vigilance that sustained survival. Vigilance itself was not only physical but mental, a shared awareness cultivated through constant communication. Families spoke often of the sounds they had heard, the tracks they had seen, the rumors they had caught of raiders moving nearby, the sightings of smoke columns that might mean fire or gathering forces. Around fires and in fields, such stories were exchanged, analyzed, and remembered, building a collective memory of danger that guided nightly routines. Each warning added to the watchfulness of all. Each retelling of past raids sharpened the readiness of children, who listened wide-eyed. Each whisper of wolves heard on the ridge reinforced the habit of keeping shutters barred. Community vigilance was a kind of shared mind. Alertness spread across many ears and eyes, ensuring that no single family bore the burden of constant fear alone. Even disputes, when they arose, were tempered by the reality that survival required unity. Land boundaries, quarrels over hunting rights, arguments over livestock trespass, such tensions were real and sometimes bitter, but they were usually set aside when night fell and the greater danger of wilderness and raiders returned. Communities learned to live with friction because they had no choice, because to fracture completely was to invite destruction. This uneasy peace, enforced by necessity, became its own form of vigilance, reminding settlers that the wilderness itself was the true enemy, and that their cabins, though individually fragile, together formed something stronger. In times of direct threat, these community bonds showed their worth most clearly. When raiders struck one cabin, neighbors often rushed to its defense, running through the dark with weapons and torches, knowing that the fire consuming one home could spread to all if not stopped, that the theft of one family's livestock left the entire settlement weaker. When predators threatened, men banded together to hunt wolves or bears that had grown bold, driving them back into the woods through coordinated effort. When sickness came, women gathered to tend the ill, sharing herbs, broths, and the burden of care so that no family was left to face it alone. Each act of solidarity was not only kindness but strategy, a recognition that the survival of one was tied to the survival of all, that vigilance had to be collective, or it would falter. Children too were woven into this web of bonds and vigilance. They were sent on errands to neighbors not only to carry messages, but to learn the geography of community, to know who lived where, to recognize signals, to understand the sounds of horns and the flicker of lanterns. Play itself often mirrored vigilance, with games that mimicked watch and chase, teaching in laughter the lessons of alertness that would one day be serious. As they grew older, they joined watches, carried muskets, stood guard with their fathers, wove cloth with their mothers, their lives shaped from the beginning by the knowledge that they were part of something larger, that their own wakefulness or neglect could affect others. Even the design of some settlements reflected this collective vigilance. Where cabins clustered closely, their stockades sometimes linked, creating larger enclosures that could be defended by multiple families. Shard wells or mills became points of gathering, places where watch could be concentrated, where news could spread quickly. Trails were kept clear not only for travel, but for defense, so that families could reach one another quickly in crisis. These physical arrangements, born of practical necessity, symbolize the invisible ties of trust and watchfulness that bound the community together, making it more than a scattering of households, but something resembling a living organism. The rhythm of seasons deepened these bonds, for harvest time, winter storms, and spring floods forced cooperation in ways no one could ignore. When crops needed gathering before frost, all hands were summoned, and when barns had to be filled, neighbors pitched in, knowing that a family weakened by hunger would endanger the rest through their desperation. When snow-trapped cabins, trails were broken collectively, paths kept open not only for travel but for signals and aid. Floods carried danger to all, and rebuilding after them became a shared task, timber cut, beams raised, roofs repaired by many hands. Each crisis reinforced the habit of vigilance, teaching that the eyes and strength of neighbors were part of one's own endurance. Stories and traditions carried the memory of these bonds. Tales of raids repelled, of fires extinguished by many buckets, of wolves driven off by shouting voices and waving torches, were told and retold, not only as history, but as instruction. Each generation absorbed the lesson that vigilance was communal, that one's own safety depended on others, that no cabin, no matter how stout, was secure without the watchfulness of those nearby. These stories lived in the fabric of daily life, shaping how people acted, how they trusted, how they remembered. Thus the frontier knight was not faced alone, but through the intertwined bonds of neighbors who shared their strength, their fears, their watchfulness, and their hope that together they could endure whatever pressed against the edges of their world. The wilderness outside and the threats within it held at bay not by one set of hands, but by many linked in vigilance.